drivers losing consciousness and crashing, drivers returning the pit lane drunk, and NASA doctors called to fix the situation. This is not sci-fi, but it's a true story. Happened on April 29th, 2001. Because in the Texas Motor Speedway there was a ghost race. A race that never happened. You probably can imagine that organizing a motorsports event is very complicated. Because you have to deal with funds, homologations, bureaucracy, safety, and it can take years to get to the green light. Two famous examples are the Vietnam Formula 1 Grand Prix or the Finland MotoGP race, which have been developed for years but never happened. Well, the story I'm telling you today, however, is nothing like that. Because everything is fine, the event is highly anticipated, and everything seems to be destined for a success. It was only in the moment that the cars entered the track for the first time that the people started to realize that something was wrong. The event is the Firestone Firehawk 600, which is scheduled to be the fourth race of the 2001 kart racing season, but it actually became the third because the race scheduled to be in Rio de Janeiro has been cancelled. So yeah, in short, that year already started badly and continued even worse. But wait a minute, when I said kart, I mean kart with the C, not with the K. And do you know what kart is? Or actually was. Kart, which stands for Championship Auto Racing Teams, was the most exciting kart championship in America. It was raced between streets, cities and ovals, inside and outside the United States. The starting grid was stellar. It was made of North and South American superstars and international legends. And that year in those races there were young talents like Dario Franchitti, Helio Castroneves, Scott Dixon, Tony Kanaan, people who years later would do great things in IndyCar, and Cristiano D'Amatta, who some years later went into Formula 1. And against these guys there were all foxes like Paul Tracy, Jimmy Vasser, Kenny Brack, Brian Herta, Michael Andretti, and the Italians Max Papis and Alex Zanardi, who however that year in September had his tragic accident. So the drivers were the best in the world, and the cars? Well, the cars were real monsters with turbo engines with almost 1,000 horsepower, capable of exceeding 400 kilometers an hour. 400. Those were the craziest performance I've ever seen in motorsports. For example, Gilles de Ferran made the pole position record in 2000 with an average speed of 241.4 miles an hour. That means 388.5 kilometers an hour of average. So back to our story, April 2001, these monsters were meant to race in the Texas Motor Speedway. A 1.5 mile long oval with super high banking corners. The banking is the slope of the corner, which allows the car to go faster into the corner, which is the basic of an oval, and which we also see in Formula 1, for example, think about Zandvoort. Well, in Texas, the banking was 20 degrees in turn 1 and 2 and 24 degrees in turns 3 and 4. That means that the car was able to do a whole lap flat out without ever lifting. This track, the Texas Motor Speedway, was new. So the first test was done in 2000 by Kenny Brack, where he was able to run smoothly with an average speed of 220 miles an hour. And here comes the first problem. That day, there was wind and low temperatures, and that car was not pushed to the limit in terms of aerodynamics and engine. But the problem is that Brack was already 6 miles an hour faster than the previous year in the Racing League pole position. So that means that with the kart, even when we were going slow, you were going faster than any other car. The problem is that that test was considered sufficient to consider the race safe. They just filled some holes in the track, they just made some adjustments on the car, but not much. So they decided not to organize any more testing, and this was the fatal decision. Many people were not happy with the decision. The concerns increased in the following month, after some other private tests, because, well, the speeds climbed to 226 miles an hour, and the driver, Mauricio Gugelmin, who was testing that day, said that it was unsafe to race like that, because the drivers were going too fast. Obviously, nobody paid attention to what he said, and the race took place in April. First practice session. Tony Kanaan averages 233.5 miles an hour, which is 376 kilometers an hour. It's fast, it's too fast. Much faster than anybody thought about the first test. And as speeds increased, the first disturbing phenomena started to occur. Many drivers after the first practice session missed the pit stop area. They just entered the pit lane and missed the area, which is Totally weird. Why? How? Nobody's understanding what's going on, but this is just the beginning. Patrick Carpentier gets out of the car and vomits, while other drivers lose their balance. Helio Castroneves is dizzy, and he said that your face felt like coming off when driving. Oriol Servia speaks of forces never before experienced in racing, and said that everything happened so fast that you didn't have the time to react. Like, a driver slowed down to enter the pit, you crash into him. The thing is that the human brain was simply not fast enough to process the informations. It was like you're constantly out of control. It became clear that in those cars in race configuration, the drivers were experiencing G-forces never experienced before. The compression on the banking was so strong that they couldn't breathe. So what were they doing? Before entering the corner, they took a deep breath and then held their breath until the next straight. You can understand that driving like this, it's impossible. Because in that oval, the corners are so long and the straights are so short that it's impossible to drive in apnea. And you know what? That the worst is yet to come. Free practice 2. Guillermin has a very bad accident. He loses control of the car in turn 2 and hits the wall with a force of 66 G. Then the car remains accelerated and continues to run until turn 3, where the car hits the wall with a deceleration of 113 G. From the first hit to the second hit, the car made 3/4 of a mile. Think about the Formula 1 circuit of Monza. It's like if you crash in the last corner and the car stops in the first corner after the whole straight. Guys, what are we talking about? You know what? The situation is so worrying because nobody understands why he crashed. He can't understand how it happened because he blacked out. He passed out while driving. And the situation gets even worse because the next day the same things happens to Cristiano D'Amatta. Another horrible crash where the driver doesn't remember a single thing. And you know what? The speed continues to rise, with Pole Racing going over 380 kilometers an hour. And the problem was that until that moment, all the drivers kept these feelings secrets. The dizziness, the blurred vision, the nausea, the feeling of fainting. And that's because the rookies didn't want to be seen as less of a man. But after the Mata crash, a member of his team reaches out the car medical director and informs him of the discomfort that the drivers were feeling. Olvey, at this point, gets Pole Tracy telemetry and notices the insane G-forces that the drivers were feeling. It was something around 5.5 Gs laterally, which is nothing new because we see it in Formula 1 all the times. But on top of that, there was 3.5 Gs vertically. Forces that nobody ever experienced in motorsport history. So at that point, Dr. Olvey says, who on earth experiences such brutal forces? Well, the astronauts. So, Dr. Olvey picks up the phone and calls the doctor that works in NASA. But you know what? Ironically, the doctor was not there because he was going to the Texas Motor Speedway to watch the race as a fan. So that was even better. Dr. Olvey met NASA doctor in the track, he showed him the telemetry, and the answer froze him. It is physiologically impossible to drive a car with this combination of lateral and vertical forces. It's worse than any roller coaster ever built. Houston, we have a problem. The race goes on, so Kenny Brack takes pole position with an average speed of 233.4 miles an hour. But the important fact is that 21 out of 25 drivers managed to drive above 228 miles an hour. That precise speed became the dividing line between the good and the bad. Above that speed, the blood rushes downward from the brain, exactly as it does to the jet pilots, but the big difference is that the jet pilots are subject only to vertical forces, while here we have lateral and vertical forces. And that's an unbearable load for the body. So that night, a meeting is held between the Dr. Olvey and the drivers, and the doctor asks who was sick while driving. Initially, nobody speaks, and the tension was palpable in that moment. Then, the first hands go up, and many more are joining. 21 out of 25 drivers were sick. Those 21 drivers experienced the so-called G-lock, a situation where you lose consciousness because of the G-forces. Listen to this, it sounds like science fiction, but there was a driver who drove from turn 2 to turn 3 totally unconscious, regaining consciousness only at the exit of turn 3. He was able to drive only thanks to the muscular memory, but he totally passed out. You can understand that running a race like this, it's impossible. But the problem is that there is a contract to fulfill, there are millions of dollars at stake, and there are tens of thousands of people who bought the ticket to get there and watch the race, and there are the televisions, and something has to be done to save the race. But nobody can find a solution. You may think we can put chicanes to lower the speed, But nobody's happy with that, and it would not be safe to race like that. You may think about slowing down the engines, but it's not possible without damaging the engine itself. And 2 hours before the race, they officially decided to postpone the race. But in fact, that race was never run again. That was an embarrassment to the people at the track and people at home. An embarrassment of the ownership of the circuit, who ended up suing CART for not having done the necessary tests. That, my friends, was the beginning of the end of the CART championship, which in the following year started to lose interest and strength, which in the end went bankrupt and was refounded in 2004 as Champ Car Championship, and which in the end in 2009 has been incorporated in the IndyCar Championship. So the story seems over, but there was one more curious detail, which is that the same weekend in April was presented to the world the movie Driven, which is the movie with Sylvester Stallone and Burt Reynolds based on CART. And without giving you any spoiler if you haven't watched the movie is so wrong that it looks like a sci-fi comic movie, which actually was not that big movie. That was a hell of a weekend.